Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading The Warmth That Changed It All by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 83, Scars. This feels nice. With a smile to herself, Weiss gave a nod and cuddled up a little closer to her girlfriend's body, allowing the comforting warmth that exuded from the blonde's body to envelop her. Despite them both laying under a clear sky and blazing sun, she suddenly felt so much warmer. It does. Weiss grinned happily. I feel free. It was true. While her classmates were surely a little surprised to see the Weiss she laid on the ground, she couldn't care less about the gazes that frequently turned her way. For the first time in her life, she had found herself without responsibility. There was nowhere to be, and nothing that needed to be done. All she had was time. And she could think of no better way to spend that time than to spend it with her girlfriend. Though I do wish you had brought some food with you. Feeling Yang shake a little with silent chuckles, Weiss looked up and saw that Yang was smiling too. For some odd reason, she was relieved to see it, but she wasn't sure why. Not that it was important, all that mattered was that they were happy. We're right next to the cafeteria. But your food is better. If you're trying to butter me up so that I'll go and get you food, you're gonna have to try harder than that. Rolling herself over and pushing herself up on all fours so that she was hovering over the woman, Weiss smiled down at her. Gazing into the beautiful lilac eyes, she leaned down and pressed their lips together. Despite being out for a while, such an open act still felt glorious. MMM. Yang hummed as they parted. Still not enough. Weiss gave her a flirtatious. And what exactly would be enough? Nothing you do in public. Yang smirked, causing Weiss' eyes to roll playfully. Ugh. Fine. She groaned, pushing herself to her knees so that she was straddling the boxer. What do you want? The glowing girl bit her lip and put her arms behind her head, the lilac eyes sweeping over her body. Well, that top gone would be my fur dash. I meant from the cafeteria, you dolt. Weiss scolded her and lightly slapped the woman's stomach, not that it did much to dissuade her. Well, you can see how I got confused. Just tell me what you want. Weiss laughed, not bothering to mention that the confusion had been entirely intentional. Pulled pork. All right then. Weiss smiled and worked herself up to her feet. I'll be right back. And then we can continue where we left off? Throwing a seductive look back at her girlfriend, she moved across the field towards the cafeteria. However, before she was even halfway across the field, she noticed something weird. The further she got from the girl, the darker things became. The shining blonde hair became faded and worn. The brilliant smile on her face turned to a worried frown again. It immediately made her want to stop, to turn back and recover the light that had been lost, but unfortunately, by the time her body caught up to her mind, she had already walked through the heavy wooden door, which slammed shut behind her with a loud bang that reverberated around the cafeteria. Or at least what should have been a cafeteria. Turning away from the door, she found that she was instead standing in a large, empty room. Its floor was filled with cracks, so much so that it was impossible to make out the pattern that was etched into it. The walls were equally as broken, its numerous windows shattered and their frames twisted. The only intact thing in the room was a long receptionist desk that stood between two collapsed elevators, and on the ground in front of it was a man wearing a black suit. Hello? There was no reply. The man just laid there unmoving. Sir? She called again, taking a step forward and feeling a chill run down her back. Are you okay? No reply. Worried that he might be hurt, she continued to advance towards the unresponsive man, but with each step the chills that ran down her back only grew stronger. Arriving at his side and kneeling down beside him, she placed a hand on his shoulder and pulled him onto his back. Do you know my OUM? She almost screamed as the man rolled onto his back. His face was pale as a ghost, his brown eyes dull and lifeless. Blood ran down the side of his mouth, the single scarlet line startlingly bright on his ashen skin. After a few seconds, though, she felt an odd wetness on her legs and looked down to see her previously white jeans were stained crimson as blood flowed steadily from the man's chest. No, Weiss muttered, reaching out and pressing her hands against the wound. Not a no-no. It did nothing. Blood flowed like water between her fingers, spilling out onto the floor unendingly and filling the air with a foul stench that Weiss could taste in the back of her throat. Help! In her panic to stop the bleeding, she forgot she was alone. Help! There's no help coming, child. There it was. The deep, monstrous voice that haunted her dreams, that fueled her nightmares. The voice she had known deep down would return eventually. It's just you. The wet slapping of a heavy footstep meeting the soaked ground came from behind her. And me. Pure terror ran through her body, and blood pounded in her ears. Every inch of her shook, and she could already feel the fearful tears streaming down her face as she suppressed the urge to vomit. Look at me! She shook her head, not wanting to turn around and see him. Look at me! Though his shout was loud enough to make her jump, it was the clang of metal on tile that caused her the most pain. It rang around the room, echoing off the walls and floors and causing a headache so bad that she thought her head was going to slip open. Not wanting to hear such a horrific noise again, she obeyed and slowly turned around. Stood by the door in a white vest and black jeans was a man. Gargantuan and muscular, his frame caused her to shrink backwards, a move that caused him to snicker wickedly behind his white mask. In one of his hands was a long, jagged piece of metal that had been turned into a makeshift sword. Pee-pee, please, she pleaded, falling backwards in her attempt to get away from him. Don't. Her begging fell on deaf ears, and her back hit the desk. There was nowhere to go. She felt weak, and even though her mind screamed for her to move, her body refused to obey. He would find her. He always did. Pathetic. He sneered and walked closer, his heavy footsteps sending waves through the ever-deepening pool of blood. Finally! An arm's distance away, he raised the sword and looked down on her. Please dash. I get to kill a schnee. With a flash of silver, the blade fell. Wise. It had been a punch to her stomach that had woken Yang. It had not been particularly strong, nor had it done enough damage to linger more time than it took for her eyes to open, but it had been enough to rouse her from the dream she was having. She was almost thankful at first, since the dream had been just as frustrating and depressing as any other she'd had in the last week, though that gratitude had quickly faded when she had seen the reason behind the sudden wake-up. Shit! Wrapped in her arms, and shaking like a leaf in the wind was Weiss, her entire body covered in a cold sweat as she jerked violently in her sleep. Having been woken up quite frequently when she was younger by RWBY, who would sneak into her bed for comfort, she immediately recognized what it was, and what had caused it. Weiss, she called, pulling back to allow her a little space and giving her a slight shake. I need you to wake up! Being a light sleeper, the woman stirred a little, but didn't wake. Come on, honey! Yang cooed, giving her girlfriend another slight nudge and suppressing her own growing worry. Dodging the hand that thrust towards her and catching it by the wrist, Yang heard the girl let out a terrified whimper and quickly let go. A fearful look overcame the heiress' face, and Yang felt a pang of pain in her chest at knowing she could do nothing to help her where she was. I'm sore dash. Yang was cut off as a horrific scream tore from Wei's throat, and her eyes shot open. Moving backwards slightly, as the white-haired woman sat bolt upright, she watched the panicked blue eyes zip around the room, as if in search of something that would hurt her. Needing Weiss to know she was safe, Yang moved into her line of sight and placed a hand on one of her legs, only to feel it flinch away again. Hey, she said quietly. You're safe. You're at home with me. Any hopes that her words might comfort the girl was lost, as not even a hint of recognition registered in her eyes. If anything, it only made her look more confused while she struggled with the blanket that had become tangled around her. Not wanting the girl to feel restricted, Yang quickly helped pull the fabric away. However, once she was free, the girl forced herself out of bed, and a loud retching sound filled the room. Fuck! She muttered, throwing herself out of bed too and seeing Weiss on all fours, a puddle of vomit below her. We need to get you to the bathroom. Unfortunately, as she reached out to rest a hand on the woman's shoulder, a hand came up to slap it away, and Weiss scurried over to the corner. Terror and confusion still painted her face, and watery eyes scanned her up and down. Weiss, please, she pleaded, getting on her knees in front of the girl. It's me. It's Yang. I'm not gonna hurt you. Finally, she saw a flash of understanding in her girlfriend's eyes, and a wave of relief rushed through her. Why, Yang? Weiss whispered in a hoarse voice. That's right. She nodded and gave the woman a soft smile. It's me. Weiss looked around with uncertainty, and her stomach gave a loud groan. I don't feel good. The bee blood. She cut herself off, as if unable to speak as more tears ran down her face. "It's okay," Yang said, holding out her hand again, but not daring to touch her without permission. "It was just a nightmare, but I need to get you to the toilet before you throw up again, okay?" It took a couple of seconds, but the scared girl eventually gave her a small nod. Another wave of relief pulsed through her, and she finally lifted the girl to her feet and guided her to the bathroom, careful to avoid the puddle of vomit that she knew would definitely not be the last of the night. "I'm back," Yang yawned, running a hand through her head. Receiving no reply, Yang let out a relieved sigh and walked into the living room to see that Weiss was still asleep on the couch. And while she knew it wouldn't last long, she was just happy that the woman was managing to get at least some rest. It had been 3 o'clock when she'd woken from her nightmare, and though Yang had known that they affected her a lot, to see just how much was something Yang had definitely not been prepared for. The way Weiss had crawled into the corner of the room and made herself as small as possible, the pure terror on her face, the way she shook uncontrollable. She'd almost looked like a child instead of the confident woman Yang had known for the past 8 months, and not much had improved in the hours since. After an hour spent in the bathroom, holding back the long white hair, Weiss had refused to return to bed. Partially because the room still smelled of vomit, though the cleaning lady was taking care of that, but also because she seemed frightened to fall back to sleep. Not that Yang blamed her. Since then though, they had spent the rest of the morning in the living room watching the random reruns that littered late-night television. Or at least Yang had. For the most part, Weiss had simply laid with her head in her lap, constantly flitting in and out of consciousness. The naps never lasted long though, normally only a few minutes at a time before the woman would wake with a start and need to be calmed down again, but they did at least seem to be lasting longer each time. 15 minutes, she muttered to herself, checking her watch and placing the parcel she'd gone to retrieve on the table. Longest one yet. Unfortunately, as she looked down at her girlfriend, she saw that the woman's closed eyes were once again fluttering. So kneeling down in front of her, Yang reached out a hand and slowly stroked a hand through Weiss' hair. Almost immediately the blue eyes flew open, and a hint of fear resided in them, but it quickly faded as Yang gave her a calm smile. "Hey," she said softly, running a thumb over one of the puffy cheeks. "It's just me." Weiss gave a nod and pulled the brown jacket tighter around her. "Where did you go?" she asked in a quivering voice that sent a pang of pain through Yang. "Just downstairs," Yang said and tapped the parcel, Weiss' eyes flicking over to it. "Reese's parcel finally came. I'll try it on for you when you're feeling better." The white-haired beauty gave a small nod and lifted her head. Knowing exactly what she wanted, Yang quickly slipped into place on the couch and allowed Weiss to go back to resting on her lap. Continuing to let her hand run soothingly through Weiss' hair, she pulled a blanket back over them. "I'm sorry," Weiss breathed, giving a little sniffle and wiping her eyes. "You were not. I thought I was past this." Yang shook her head. "You're fine. Nobody expects you to just get over what happened." Especially not with bitches like Talk running around, she thought bitterly to herself. "I know," Weiss muttered and shifted a little. "It is just, with everything that happened, my father, the media, that girl, I guess I've been on edge a little. But I thought I was stronger than this." Her insides twisted at that confession and Jacques' words rang in her head, just as they had been ever since his visit. Pushing them aside though, just as she had been doing all morning since that was definitely not the energy Weiss needed, she used a thumb to wipe away one of the tears that began to form in the woman's eye. "You are?" Yang countered. "This is just one of those days we all have. It's nothing to be ashamed of." Feeling Weiss give a small nod into her lap, Yang reached over to the side table and grabbed the bottle of water that was sat there. Angling the straw into Weiss' mouth so that she didn't have to get up, she waited for the woman to take a sip before pulling it away. Thankfully, while she was adamantly refusing any food offered to her, she didn't seem to mind drinking in small quantities. "Thank you." She placed the empty bottle back on the table. "You really should eat something though." "I'm not hungry. Just a slice of dry toast." The girl shook her head and Yang sighed internally. She knew that was not a good sign, and that there wasn't anything she could do about it. After all, she couldn't force the woman to eat. "All right," she breathed. "But let me know when you are, okay? I'm here all day, so I can cook whatever you want." Once again, Weiss shook her head. "You and Ty have therapy." I can reschedule that. Another shake of the head. I don't want you to. For the first time all morning, Weiss' voice held the same strength and conviction it usually did, but it quickly faded. Please don't put off fixing your relationship for this. But what about you? Yang asked. I'm not gonna leave you here alone. Call Win. Call Whitley. Yang didn't miss the first part. While she knew Weiss loved her brother, she didn't doubt that Winter was really who she wanted. As cold as the older Schnee could be, knew that the woman was always willing to do anything to make Weiss feel safe. Unfortunately, despite the clear lengths Winter would go to be at Weiss' side, even she couldn't get from one country to another in 90 minutes. All right. Yang nodded, still not fond of leaving her, but knowing better than to argue with her. I'll call him, but you have to at least try and eat something for me when I get back, okay? She wasn't sure if it was a lie or not, but Weiss gave a small nod of her head. However, knowing it was the best she was going to get, she gave the girl a smile. All right, she nodded. I'm gonna get you some more water and call him. After letting Weiss sit up, Yang pushed herself up from the chair and pressed a kiss against the woman's forehead. Thankfully, she no longer felt cold, but there was still a little clamminess that she knew would persist for a little while longer. I'll be right back, she smiled, earning a weak smile in return as Weiss pulled the blanket tighter around herself. Yang grabbed the water bottle and the heiress scroll and made her way out of the room. Opening the device as she entered the kitchen, she quickly found Whitley's number and hit call. It took almost a minute, but the boy eventually answered with a frustrated tone. You are aware that I was in the middle of class, right, sister? Crap, Yang thought to herself. With everything that had happened, she'd completely forgotten that it was a school day. Sorry, she muttered and filled up the bottle. And it's Yang, by the way. Oh, he paused. Why are you calling me? The boy remained quiet as Yang filled him in on what had happened, and even though she couldn't see his reaction, she could tell he was just as troubled by it as she was by the small sighs that escaped him. Well, that is hardly a surprise. If Yang wasn't mistaken, there was a slight hint of sympathy in his voice. She has never liked hearing mention of that day, and all of this attention to your past was bound to set it off at some point. Thanks. Yang groaned and leaned against the sink. Way to make me feel worse. Would you rather I lie to you? She could hear the scowl on his face. No. She breathed and shook her head. Look, Weiss isn't letting me cancel this appointment, and someone needs to be here for her. Someone she trusts. Well, I am at school, the boy replied, but I will see what I can do. Thank you. MHM, the boy mumbled. I will text you when it is sorted. All right. Bye, Dash. The call ended before she could finish her goodbye, and Yang let out a sigh, dropping the scroll onto the counter. Being told straight up that her past was the reason that Weiss had been so easily affected by what happened was not exactly something she wanted to hear. Mostly because she'd already been telling herself that for most of the morning, but also because it only pilled more guilt onto what she had been feeling for the past week. She knew she should have been letting what Jacques had said affect her, knew that it was his intention to shake her and create doubt, but she also knew that none of what he'd said had been wrong. She had coasted for her entire school and college life, only ever doing the bare minimum to pass, and never trying to push herself to be more. And despite having spent the week poring over books on business and sitting in on lectures, all those things did was highlight just how little she knew. No matter how much time she put into it, no matter how much she read or listened to, she understood none of it. But Weiss wasn't like that. Weiss excelled and strived to be the best in everything she did, especially business. The heiress was always happiest when she was leading and organizing, when she was in charge and doing things that actually mattered. And if the past month of being Jacques' assistant had proven anything, it was that she would definitely not allow herself to be held back. Sadly though, Yang knew that's exactly what she would be doing. Her past, her friends, her family. Everything about her was going to create doubt, and doubt would mean that opportunities would lessen. And with it becoming increasingly obvious to Yang that she understood nowhere enough about business to start her own, how was she meant to give back any of what she was taking away? And how would Weiss feel about that in the future? She was fine with it now, but even Raven had said that people changed, that the world shaped them into something different, so how would it shape Weiss? It was those questions that had been rattling around her head for the last week. And Weiss quitting her job after feeling held back had definitely not helped matters. She knew it wasn't the same, that Jacques was purposely doing it, but the woman had still been unhappy and unwilling to abide by it. That anger in her voice, the frustration in her eyes, they had only served to heighten the fears that one day she would regret their relationship. Yang? Pulled from her thoughts by Weiss' concerned voice, Yang realized that she had been standing at the sink for too long. A look at her watch showed that a good 5 minutes had passed since leaving the room, so with a shake of her head, she let go of the sink and wiped a tear from her cheek. See coming. Stupid Yang. Today is not the day for this shit, Yang thought to herself and splashed a little water on her face. Weiss needed her to be strong, not doubtful, so wiping herself dry and putting on a brave face, she picked up the water bottle and the scroll, upon which was a message from Whitley telling her it was sorted, and made her way back into the front room to comfort her girlfriend. Yang knew she was late as she pushed through the doors and arrived into the reception area. Not only had Whitley been late, so much so that she'd had to leave before he'd even shown up, but construction had made getting to the building a nightmare. Thankfully though, it was only 10 minutes past when the appointment was supposed to start, and she'd already texted her dad to tell him that she would likely be late. Yang, the man said with a small hint of relief as he stood from one of the chairs. Sorry, she blustered to both Ty and the receptionist, who gave an understanding smile and picked up the phone. It's fine, her dad said, gave her a concerned look. Though fine is not a word I'd use to describe you today. You look exhausted. I know. Yang sighed and shook her hair to get rid of her helmet head. Some asshole decided to set off Weiss' PTSD for fun, so it's been a shit night. What? He sounded just as appalled as she had when Blake had told her. Then you should have canceled to stay with her. This can wait. I was going to, but Weiss would dash. She was cut off by a polite cough and looked aside to see the receptionist giving her a smile. Dr. Dark says you can go straight in. Taking a deep breath and running a hand through her hair, Yang placed her helmet on the woman's desk and gave her dad a hard look. I'm here now anyway, she exhaled and pointed to the door. So let's just do this. Though she certainly hadn't intended it to sound dismissive, she knew that it had. Feeling a little guilty due to knowing that was exactly the kind of behavior he had spoken about at their last session, Yang took another deep breath as the man walked towards the door and closed her eyes to calm herself. Unfortunately, with it having been a few weeks since she'd last meditated, the calm eluded her, and she once again had to settle for simply pushing it down instead. Burying it all, and putting a lid on it for the time being, she took another breath, opened her eyes, and followed her dad into Dark's office. Good afternoon. Dark smiled at them both from behind his desk, wearing the exact same clothes he had before. Afternoon, they both replied. I hope you both had a good 2 weeks. Both of them gave little more than a small mutter as they sat down. While she would hardly consider the past week good, that was not what she was there to talk about. Looking over to her dad, she saw that he too was looking a little ragged with his stubble once again unshaved. I see. The man hummed and quickly jotted something down. Then I promise to understand if either of you feel inclined to be a little less talkative today. Yang gave the man a grateful nod and watched him sit up in his chair and entwine his fingers. So the last time you were here, we made some good progress on what it is exactly that you two want from each other going forward, but we also talked a little on how things are at home. You both expressed that you felt it was a tense environment, so I would like to go back in time a little bit and try to understand the cause of this tension. Do either of you recall a time when this wasn't the case? And if so, what do you remember about? They were both silent for a minute as they thought back, but it was Ty who raised his hand first. Dark gave him an acknowledging nod. For me, the last time I can remember was before my wife died, he said, a heaviness to his voice. She definitely threw her share of temper tantrums, but most of the time she was the happiest kid alive. We'd always joke around and tease Summer, and she would always come to me asking to do things together. I remember we used to make tents in the field behind the house every Friday and camp out. It was never far from the house, but I enjoyed it. Yang remembered that. As he said, it had never been more than a few feet from the house, but they'd always acted as if it was the middle of nowhere. They'd use sheets to block the house from view and spent the entire night talking about Mistral or their family. It was also during those camping sessions where she had first taken an interest in cooking, as Ty had stationed a fire pit in the area to cook fish they'd catch from the nearby stream. It sounds like you had a good relationship. Dark smiled and noted it down. We did. Ty nodded. Would you agree, Yang? Knowing she had absolutely been a daddy's girl as a kid, she gave a nod. And would you say that what your last memory of when things weren't tense at home lines up with what your dad just said? Not really, she said truthfully with a shrug and crossed her arms. While Ty looked at her curiously, Dark simply gave her an understanding nod and wrote something down again. Would you like to go a little deeper? Yang stayed quiet for a moment. She certainly knew when things had changed for her, but she didn't know how to say it without making her dad feel worse than he already did about that time. It's perfectly fine if you don't, Dark added in a friendly voice. But as I said last session, you can only get out of these sessions what you are willing to put into them. Fine, she breathed and felt her knee begin to shake. It was after your mother passed, died. Dark's eyebrows raised slightly at Yang's interruption. She still hated that people thought Summer had passed away. Passing away implied peace. It gave the impression that everybody involved had some closure or some time to prepare. But there was none of that for them. Summer had died. She had been suddenly torn from the world, leaving nothing but a hole behind in everyone who knew her. A hole that could never truly heal. My mom didn't pass away. She died. My apologies, Dark acknowledged and scribbled something down. So things changed after your mother died? Yang nodded. After Mom died, he made me feel safe. He was around more, he took care of us, and he'd let us get into bed with him when we couldn't sleep. He made me feel like everything was going to be okay, and then he stopped. Glancing to her side, she saw that her dad was looking away from her. And while a part of her felt bad for making him feel such a way, another part of her felt glad to finally say that in the open. And should I assume that this all stopped around the time he began to drink heavily? Yang gave another nod. Interesting. He thumbed through the large file that Yang knew to be Ty's. And roughly how long after Summer's death would you say this happened? I dunno. Yang shrugged. It had been hard to keep track of the days back then. 2, maybe 3 weeks. I see. The man hummed appreciatively and fell silent as he read through the papers. It was at least a minute later that he noted something down and turned his attention back to Ty. Ty, he said with a thoughtful look, I see the answer that you gave to your rehabilitation therapist here, but would you mind clarifying for me why it is that you feel you started drinking? Yang's eyebrows raised, as for the first time Ty did not seem ready with an answer. Summer had been there almost every day of my life, and waking up knowing I could never see her again was too painful. The doctor hummed. I have no doubt that would be an extremely painful thing to do, but, and forgive me for this, I can't help but wonder if there is maybe a little more to it. What do you mean? Yang asked. She'd thought all of that had been dealt with long ago. Well? Dark sat back in his chair and motioned a hand toward the file, causing a slight hint of fear to jolt through her at what was about to possibly be revealed. Your dad was at the rehabilitation center for 2 months, during which time he attended daily therapy sessions. However, the story you just told was never mentioned. In fact, his own words during the session give off the impression that his drinking began within a week of Summer's death. Almost a month's worth of time is a lot to leave out, Ty. Yang looked over at her dad and saw him staring at his lap. I find it curious that you and Yang share different views on when this tension between you both began. While Yang's recollection is after you began drinking, yours is after your wife's death, almost a month prior. I also couldn't help but notice that you looked away from Yang when she spoke of that month, and in my experience, that often means that the person is uncomfortable with what is being said. So, considering these parts have seemingly been purposely omitted, my gut tells me that you are aware of why it is you were uncomfortable with Yang's story. Ty looked away again, but this time Yang saw actual pain in his eyes before he did. What Dark had just said had clearly struck a nerve, and from her dad's reaction Yang knew immediately that the man's assumption was right. Dad? He shook his head. This is a safe space to talk, Ty. Yang watched as her dad's body began to shake. Finally, though, after almost a minute, he spoke in a voice so quiet that she was barely able to hear it. I wasn't ready to have kids. Silence filled the room, and Yang tried to process what the man had just admitted. What? She said when her attempt failed. Despite her attempt to keep it in check, even she heard the anger in her voice. Neither of you were planned, he said in a strained voice. It was easy with Summer there because she always wanted kids and knew how to do it all, but when she was gone it all fell to me. All those moments after she died, you and Ruby waking me up when I could barely sleep myself, always asking for things when I was barely keeping it together. I just... He paled and shook his head. I just wanted you both to be quiet and leave me alone. Yang was quiet. I never brought it up because I knew it was wrong to feel that way, and when the drinking stopped and I left rehab, my mind was clearer. I still didn't know if I was ready, but at the very least things felt easier after. She didn't even bother to stop the scoff that left her. Almost immediately, Dark raised his eyebrow at her and noted something down. I have no doubt that you have something to say, Yang, and I will happily hear you out, but I would like for your dad to finish what he was saying first, he said calmly. After a few seconds of silence, Dark motioned for Tai to continue, which, after a hesitant look in her direction, he did. When I got home, things felt easier. I still woke up every morning missing Summer, but I wasn't struggling as much and decided to do everything I could to make sure I was ready to be a dad to you. Shaking her head and letting out a humorous chuckle, she felt anger rushing through her system once again. Of course, things had been easier for him. Can I? She asked Dark hotly. Feel free. Good. She turned angrily on her dad. Do you want to know why things were easier for you? It's because you didn't have to actually do anything. You were able to sit back and be the cool dad you always wanted to be because by the time you left rehab, I had already done all the work for you. I was the one who comforted her after Mom died. I was the one who helped her with schoolwork. I did the cooking and the cleaning and made sure her life didn't fall apart. I was even the one who got her diagnosed and helped her through that. You say you weren't ready to be a dad at 27? Well, I wasn't ready to be a mom at 7, yet I still did it despite just losing mine. Things were easy for you. Well, lucky you, because they were never easy for me. Things weren't easy for me, Eat Dash. Please, I gave you a free fucking ride, she spat. I sacrificed Everett Dash. I lost things too, Yang. Dark gave a pointed cough, but Yang ignored him. Like fuck you did. What did Yo Dash? I lost you. His voice echoed throughout the room, assaulting Yang's ears and causing her to flinch, and despite her anger, she immediately fell quiet. It had been quite some time since he'd last shouted at her, a few years at least, but never before had she heard him shout like that. Even in her heated state, she heard the pain behind those words. You think I don't know what you had to do in my place? He said, his voice just as angry as hers had been. You think I don't see what you still do? I promise you I do. And because I see it, I know that you don't need me anymore. I can be a dad to Ruby, but you were my little girl, my firecracker, and you outgrew me before I even had a chance to fix myself. Because of my mistakes, because of my issues, I missed out on it, and all I can do now is watch as you live your life knowing that the only real thing I have ever given you is pain and hardship, knowing that there is not a moment of your childhood that either of us can look back on happily. So don't you dare say I've lost nothing, because to me that is everything. Whatever anger had been left in Yang quickly faded as she saw the tears in her dad's eyes. Seeing the man cry was a much more common occurrence than hearing him shout, but it still hit her just as hard. While her words had been true, in her anger she'd forgotten just how heavily those truths weighed on the man. I didn't, she muttered, but shook her head and looked down. I'm sorry. Tai didn't respond, but out of the corner she saw him look down too, and silence filled the space between them, the only sound being the scratching of a pen on paper. That probably wasn't a good sign, was it? Yang muttered. On the contrary, I think it was rather healthy, Dark said in a light tone. People have this misconception regarding anger, that it is ugly and something that should be squashed, but there are moments where anger can push us to tell our truths, even ones that we would rather not say for fear of hurting a loved one's feelings. It may not lead to those truths being said in the healthiest of ways, but at least once they are said, we can begin to unpack them. Yang doubted that. Throughout her whole life, her anger had never done anything but get her into trouble. For example, Yang. He sat back and put his notepad on his lap. You said that when Tai began to drink you were forced to raise your sister on your own. That one day things changed, and that you were suddenly faced with a responsibility you had no way to prepare for? I was a kid, Yang replied, knowing that he was getting at. He wasn't. That is true, Dark nodded. A factor that shows how strong of a person you are. However, just like with anger, age is often misunderstood. Society tells us that with each passing year, we should be smarter and more capable to handle whatever life throws our way, when in reality that growth comes not from age, but experience. So what happens when life throws something at us that we have yet to experience? But he raised us for 7 years before that. He wasn't inexperienced. He raised you with the help of your mother. Dark clarified and wrote something down. You have been raising your sister for 12 years now, and in those 12 years was there ever anyone who helped you? Yang didn't even have to think about that question. From the moment they'd become friends, she had always been willing to help Ruby with anything she'd needed, treating the girl as if she was family. My friend, Blake, she nodded. And since she came into the picture, has that burden lessened at all? Or does it remain the same? Yang thought back to when Blake had started to become a regular around the house, and realized that things had indeed become much easier. While she had still had to make sure that Ruby was clean and fed and ready for school, Blake had quite frequently taken her place when it came to homework. She'd also had someone to talk to share her day with, and even someone to take care of Ruby when she needed some time alone. It has. Now can you imagine yourself in your dad's position? Spending 7 years with Blake by your side, helping you, sharing in your responsibility of a truly daunting task, only to one day disappear and leave you to shoulder that burden alone. That was definitely not a scenario Yang wanted to think about. Losing Blake would be like losing a part of herself. It hadn't just been Ruby that the girl had helped her with, but also with almost every other aspect of her life. From the bullying at school to the issues with her dad, Blake had been there through it all, just like Summer had for Ty. She too had been his childhood friend, present for almost every part of his life. Being married, raising children, they were likely only a few of the things she'd helped the man through in their time together. And given what Ty had told her about his drinking habits in high school, Yang had to wonder if that was something else her mom had helped him with. I suppose so, Yang mumbled. He gave a small nod and wrote something down. It's completely fine if you find yourself unable to relate fully. Dark smiled and looked up at her. As you said, the situations are different. I'm simply trying to help you find that middle ground. Giving the man a nod of understanding and looking over to her dad, she saw that he was running a hand through his hair. It wasn't hard to figure out why, as she was fairly confident as to what came next. And to that aim, he smiled. Would you mind repeating what you said about the last time you felt there was no tension at home for me? Though she was confused, Yang agreed and repeated what she had said earlier about how her dad had made her feel safe after her mom's death. Seeing his eyes flicker over to Ty, she turned towards him as she spoke, and saw that he was once again looking away from her. Did you hear that, Ty? Dark said once she was finished. Despite all your fears that you weren't ready to be a dad, your daughter thinks quite highly of what you consider your darkest days. In fact, during her darkest days, you were succeeding in making her feel safe. Now I'm not one myself, but that to me sounds like exactly what a good dad should be doing. I didn't feel like a good dad, he muttered. Then I think that is what we should focus on in our next session. Dark smiled and placed his notepad on the desk. Looking down at her watch, Yang saw that there were only 5 minutes left of their session. She hadn't realized that time had flown by that quickly, but she definitely felt more tired. So are you gonna tell us what our issue is today? Yang asked curiously. She had expected the man to tell them no after that display, but to her surprise, he gave them both a smile and nodded his head. I'm still not 100% certain, he said with a hum, but it is my belief that both of you still hold a lot of past trauma close to your chest. Young, your anger and resentment towards your dad for the burden he placed on your shoulders has made you distrustful towards letting him in. You are so used to doing things on your own and so scared of him letting you down again that you keep him at a distance, which only furthers your tendency to become irritable when he tries to offer his support. Yang definitely couldn't deny that there was still some soreness in that area. As for you, Ty, you acknowledge that Yang has grown beyond the point of needing a father figure in her life, but your fixation on making up for your past failures causes you to try and reclaim what you know has already been lost. Unfortunately, that will only end in disappointment, which in turn only reinforces your belief that you are unable to make amends. From the look on Ty's face, it seemed Dark's words had struck a note with him too. Which is why, Dark continued, before our next appointment, I would like you to do something together. Ty, you said that the both of you like to camp, so find a nice spot and, whether it's for an hour or two, just talk. Not of your past or your problems, but of your present and your future. I want you to try and create a new memory that can help remind you both of the last time that you felt comfortable in each other's presence. You think that'll work? Yang asked. You two have a lot of painful memories together that revolve around resentment and guilt. And while these sessions are hopefully going to help undo those knots, it's also important that you start getting comfortable being around each other again. Yang supposed that was a valid point. After all, what was the point of working out their issues if they weren't sure how to even be around each other without arguing? So giving the man a nod, she stood up and held out her hand. We'll give it a try, she agreed as the man shook her hand. Right, Dad? Why, yeah, he replied, a hint of worry in his voice. That's all I ask. Dark smiled and bowed his head. I look forward to hearing how it goes. With a smile that was only slightly forced, she dropped the man's hand and exchanged a quick goodbye. She was almost certain she would never look back on the session fondly, but at the very least Dark seemed to be satisfied with what had happened, so she supposed that was just how therapy was sometimes. Even as she followed her dad out of the door, Raven's words echoed in her head. Things will get worse before they get better. I'm home. Stepping into the apartment and dropping her keys into the bowl beside the elevator door, Yang let out a low sigh and ran a hand through her hair. The fact that even riding her bike was no longer enough to pull her thoughts away from things was more than a little annoying. Wise, she called, receiving no reply. You asleep? She is. The unfamiliar, female voice caught Yang off guard, and she looked up to see Weiss' mom stood in the entryway to the kitchen. She looked better than Yang had ever seen her. Her hair was neat and swept to the side, clearly having been recently cut and styled. Her clothes were pristine, and for once she looked alive. Unlike every time Yang had seen her, there was no far-off look in her eyes. Instead, they were clear and bright, almost exactly like her daughter's. For half an hour now. Good. Yang breathed and shrugged her jacket off. While she was glad that Weiss was improving, albeit slowly, a sudden feeling of awkwardness fell upon her as she realized that meant she and Willow would be alone for the first time ever. And Willow, while was not like shock, not even remotely, the woman was still Weiss' mom and someone the heiress loved. I'm guessing Whitley called you, Yang asked, having expected to come home and find the younger boy there instead. MHM, the woman confirmed. Begrudgingly. He also told me what happened. Good. Yang nodded and motioned towards the kitchen. You want a drink? You don't have to go out of your way, the woman said respectfully. I'm making myself one anyway. Yang suppressed a yawn and scratched the back of her head while walking to the kitchen. Coffee or tea? A coffee then, please. She relented and followed, sitting down at the aisle. Water or milk? Milk. Nodding and pulling out what she needed, she sorted out the cups, flipping the stove on, and placed a pot of milk onto a ring. While for it to boil, she rested her arms against the counter and stretched them. The day had definitely been the most trying one she'd had in some time, and the fact that nothing had been said between her and Ty after the session had not exactly been a positive sign. How's she doing? She asked after a few minutes of awkward silence, looking over her shoulder towards the room she knew Weiss would be asleep in. Scared, Willow replied in a sad voice. I don't blame her. Yang breathed, pouring the heated liquid into the mugs and stirring them. But I talked to my friend on the way back. She was there last night. And what did she say? Turning around and placing the cup down on the table, she sat on the other side of the aisle and took a sip of her drink. Even the wonderful taste of strawberry that filled her mouth wasn't enough to raise her spirits. She said the girl who did it is being charged. Good. It was only there for a second, but Yang saw a shadow pass over the woman's eyes, but didn't blame her. Yang agreed, and even Blake had seemed relieved about the fact Talk was being charged when she told her. Yeah, Yang hummed. Apparently the district attorney showed up this morning and said she's filing domestic terrorism charges against her too. Willow's eyebrow raised in surprise, and Yang once again understood how the woman felt. She too had been surprised that the situation was being handled so seriously, especially since it sounded like the decision had come from nowhere after the police had originally filed assault with intent to harm charges. I am guessing that would be my other daughter, Willow theorized and took a sip of her drink. Since the incident, she has kept an ear to the ground for any white fan activity in Vale. That definitely made a lot more sense. Though Yang didn't know how Winter could have influenced the district attorney, she definitely wouldn't put it past her. especially given that the attack was against Weiss. Makes sense. Jan yawned. Either way, eyewitnesses saw her running away, and she was caught with a mask, so she's going down for a long time. So the day ends with good news, Willow concluded with zero sympathy in her voice. Had it been any other day, Young might have had some herself. After all, even she didn't like all the restrictions that had been placed on the Faunus and the White Fang since the incident, especially since the measures taken were quite often a little intrusive to their privacy. However, with everything that had happened, with how terrified she had seen her girlfriend last night, she couldn't find it within herself to feel anything for talk. MHM. Jan yawned. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Willow give her a worried look. You could probably do with getting some rest too, she said, and cradled her drink. Jan shook her head. She didn't want to be asleep when Weiss woke up. I'm good, she replied. Are you sure? Willow asked cautiously. It's not uncommon for patients to feel tired after therapy sessions, and given the morning you've had. I'm fine, Jan replied. It came out a little shorter than she intended, but Willow didn't seem to take offense. My apologies, the woman backpedaled. That wasn't my place. It's fine. Thankfully, that one came out a little less heated. Sorry. It just wasn't a good session is all. If you want to talk. Jan was unsure. While she appreciated the offer, she wasn't exactly keen to talk about what had been said in the session, especially not when thinking back on it still made her want to shout and throw something. However, Jan also knew that the woman in front of her had, and probably still was, gone through a lot of what Tai had. After a couple of minutes of silence, though, she made up her mind. When did? She paused and shook her head. When did you know you were ready for kids? Willow looked taken aback for a second, but quickly recovered. I didn't, she said, looking down at her coffee. And if I were to be honest, I'm still not. You're not. The Schneek gave a shake of her head. Given how my son hates me, that much is clear. But as a good man once told me, though I may have failed before, that does not mean I cannot try again. It is in retrying that we learn from our mistakes, and if I try hard enough, then maybe one day I will get the chance to show how much I have changed and earn my children's forgiveness. That hardly made Jan feel any better. While the woman's answer was much more forward and open than Tai's had been, it was still exactly the same one, serving only to make her question if that really was just how most parents felt. Tai, Raven, Willow, even she herself, none of them had felt ready when the time had come. Had Summer felt ready? Or was she simply like her, trying her best and hoping she was doing a good job? Unfortunately, though, that would just be another one of those things that she would never know. And if they don't forgive you? Yang asked curiously. While sadness entered her eyes, there was also a hint of acceptance. Then that is their choice. I will not stop being there for them should they need me, but the bed I made is my own, and I shall lie in it. Another answer that did nothing to make her feel better, only confirming that it was now down to her to decide whether she could forgive her dad or not. Thanks. She sighed and pushed herself to her feet, having much more to think about than she had before. Of course, the woman said with a courteous nod. Anyway, she breathed and finished her drink. I'm a check on Weiss real quick. You can stay for lunch if you'd like. I would like that. Willow smiled, taking another sip of her drink. Chapter 84. Keep moving forward. Sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her, Weiss stifled a small yawn. She was tired. More tired than she had been in months, yet proper sleep still eluded her. It had been over a year since the dreams had affected her so badly, but the fact that it still could was more than a little frustrating. The occasional dream and rough morning were expected, Dr. Dark had even told as much, but those usually faded within a few hours. Unfortunately, even 2 days after the episode, she still found herself waking up every few hours with her head racing and a nauseous feeling in her stomach. However, having started to feel guilty about constantly waking Young up, she'd finally decided to give up and move to the couch. It wasn't as warm, and she already missed the feeling of Yang's arms around her, but with everything the woman was going through herself, Weiss didn't want to make her days worse due to lack of sleep. So instead, she was having to make do with a jacket that the girl had gifted to her months ago, even though it had long since stopped smelling of her, and the morning talk show. It wasn't the most interesting thing in the world, but the hosts were at least charming, and there was something she knew would be on that she was interested in seeing. Coming at 6, we'll be trying a selection of the most renowned drinks from Vacuo to see which is truly the fizziest fizz in all of Remnant. The woman listed off, no doubt speaking from a teleprompter. At 6:15, we'll be talking with Jacques Schnee of the STC about the exciting new Hollyviewer that will be hitting shelves in just a few days, her male co-host added. And at 6:30, we'll be heading over to the kitchen with Bracken Wool to taste her delicious cupcakes. Weiss didn't know if it was because she was dating Yang, but even she heard the innuendo in that sentence, and clearly so did the presenter, as she had to turn away from the camera to hide the chuckles that overcame her. From the reaction of her co-host and the camera crew, who were all also giggling, it seemed like such things were not too uncommon. Nevertheless, they continued. Not caring at all about which drink in vacuo was the fizziest, Weiss tuned out what was being said and opened her scroll. Unfortunately, there was still no message from Seal regarding what she'd asked her to check the day before, but she wasn't really too surprised since the girl had likely only just started work. Instead, she looked up a tech store in Vale and searched for the Hollyviewer. Just as she suspected, the price for it was much higher than it needed to be at almost twice the production cost. Using excitement around the product to inflate its price had always been an effective business practice, and though Weiss understood it to a degree, it wasn't her favorite. Having been present for the meetings during its development, she knew that it took far less resources to make than a regular television, and there was no doubt in her mind that the new Hollyviewer could easily have a quarter of its price knocked off and still generate a generous profit. Yet, just as her father and the board tended to do with everything, they had taken the opportunity to squeeze people for more money rather than make it affordable. Letting out a sigh and collapsing her scroll again, she leaned back into the chair and took a bite of her toast and ignored the churning in her stomach. Food was also something her body had yet to allow. Even the smell of it was enough to make her feel queasy, but she had thankfully managed to keep down a few things. Mostly dry toast and soup, but it was better than nothing. That bacon one's still clinging to the back of my throat, the man on the television said with a disgusted look, causing his co-host to chuckle at him. Seriously, I'll be tasting that one for a week. Oh, stop it, it wasn't that bad. The woman smiled as the drinks were taken away. Now, with how big televisions have been getting in recent years, it can be rather frustrating to find the space for them, but what if we were to tell you that those days might be coming to an end? Yes, in just a few short days, the STC will be releasing the brand new Hollyviewer, a device that is set to revolutionize how you approach organizing your living room. He held up a small, square device that was easily able to fit in his palm. Being only 4 inches by 4 inches, the incredible little device is capable of being placed on any surface you like to generate an image that is just as clear as the best-selling televisions on the market. Tuning the host out again as they turned it on and began to fiddle with the screen sizes and channels, she pulled open her scroll and sent off a text message. Given that it had been revealed a few days ago that the interview would happen, she was fairly certain that someone she knew was also watching it. Sure enough, seconds later her scroll lit up with Ruby's name. Yes, it's so cool. Despite her mood, Weiss couldn't help but smile a little. And here with us in the studio today to explain the device a little more is none other than Jacques Schnee himself. The camera panned across to the other side of the couch to show her father. He looked comfortable and relaxed, an easy smile on his face that made him look younger by many years. But Weiss knew it was an act, a carefully constructed facade honed to perfection over multiple years of attending interviews. As she looked upon it, she couldn't help but wonder if that was the very same facade he had used to woo her mother so many years ago. Thank you for having me, he said, his tone light and friendly. It's great to be here. Yeah, right, Weiss thought to herself. Having been the one to schedule the interview, she knew that the only reason that the man had agreed to appear on the show was because it was popular with the elderly, who tended to wake up earlier. No doubt the man intended to try and sell them on its convenience, since pretty much any businessman knew that trying to quote specs and innovation to the older generation was pointless. Too many simply didn't care, and were fine with what they had. So tell us, the woman said with a smile, though Weiss could tell it wasn't as genuine as the one she had given to the previous guest. What was in your mind when making this? Quite a few things actually, Ivy. Jacques smiled, picking up the device and turning it in his hand. Limiting power consumption was definitely a big one, as was making sure the screen was large enough to compete with standard televisions. But I think the thing we really kept in mind when developing this was its size. There it was, just as she'd guessed. At least there were some parts of his behavior that she could still predict. Already though she regretted tuning into the interview, as it was clear to her that the questions had been carefully curated beforehand, making it less an interview and more of an infomercial. Thankfully, she felt her scroll buzz in her hands and looked down to see another message from Ruby. How's the power consumption? I bet it takes a lot. It's not too much, actually. More than an average television, but less than the higher-end ones. As she sent the message, she felt a small hint of satisfaction bloom within her chest. It had been days since she had done anything that even came close to work, and even though it was in the loosest sense possible, pitching the Holliviewer to the redhead at least made her feel like she was doing something. After all, having quit the STC, she wouldn't get another chance until Fletch came to town in a few days to discuss their partnership. Thankfully, she wasn't worried about that part in the slightest. He'd already accepted, all there was to do was iron out some details, and they could begin. Can I attach a battery to it? One is already in development. Oh, cool, and how does the inside look? I don't know. Sorry. It's fine, I'll just grab one when it shows up at the junkyard. Or... Smiling to herself, Weiss reopened the page for the store she'd brought up earlier and added 2 of the devices to the cart. Or what? She ignored the message and entered her card information. Weiss. Ignoring it again, she put in the address of Ty's house and checked out, quickly approving automated confirmation her bank sent her. Snapping a screenshot of the receipt, she returned to her conversation with Ruby and sent the picture with the caption. One to use, one to take apart. The reply didn't take long to come in. OMG. Why did you do that? That's too much. Chuckling slightly to herself as all 3 came in individually, Weiss shook her head and took another bite of her toast. Both sisters seemed to forget just how wealthy she was, and that only made her love them more. It's not for me. Think of it as an early birthday present, and an apology for exposing you to the difficulties of my life. Before the girl replied, she sent off a second message. The money has already been taken out, so it's too late to change it now. The girl didn't reply straight away. Why the new girl was just like her sister, and wasn't fond of being given expensive things, and that she had a tough time accepting them given. However, while Weiss was perfectly willing to wait for Ruby to come to a decision on her regarding vegan, gifts were just something the girl would have to get used to. That's not your fault. That had not been the reply she expected. I know. But I want there to at least be some good that comes from knowing me. You're my friend and you make Young happy. That's plenty of good. Feeling a warm settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the blanket or the jacket, Weiss smiled at the admission. Nevertheless, I would still like to be able to buy my friends gifts, even though I know they are not needed. Another small pause followed, and Weiss took another bite of her food. To her surprise, the slice of dry toast was almost gone, and though the realization did slowly start to make her stomach feel a little uneasy again, she knew that it was progress. With any luck, she would be back to eating her girlfriend's delicious cooking soon. Then I promised to take good care of it. Well, one of them. Do with them as you please. Relaxing a little at the fact Ruby had accepted the gift, Weiss let out a happy sigh and forced herself to finish the last of the toast. Placing the plate on the table, she nestled back into the chair and brought her legs up underneath her to get comfortable to watch the rest of the show. Feeling another message come in, she looked down and couldn't help but chuckle at Ruby's message. He's got no idea what he's talking about, does he? The reply to that one was easy. No. Weiss knew it shouldn't be as hard as it was to look up. It was a simple action that required only 22 of the hundreds of muscles in the human body, a fact she had researched the second time such a difficulty had arisen. Unfortunately, as simple as looking up was, her body refused to obey. The idea of seeing her reflection, the knowledge of the reaction it was caused was not something she wanted, especially not when her stomach had finally settled down a little. Come on, Weiss! She breathed, hunched over the sink with a white-knuckle grip on the edge. Just look up! Tensing her shoulders and taking a deep breath, she tried to force her neck onto an upright position. Yet again, nothing happened. Disappointment rushed through her, and she shook her head instead. Damn it! She swore to herself. Weiss! Yang's voice came from the bathroom door. You okay? Yeah, she lied, trying to make her voice sound steady. I'll be out in a second. All right. She heard the uncertainty in her girlfriend's voice, and for a few seconds there was quiet, But eventually footsteps moved away from the door, and Weiss let out a low sigh. She hated being so insecure, hated letting such a small thing control her, but she also knew that forcing it wasn't going to help matters. If anything, it would only make things worse. So, resigning to not push herself more than she should, Weiss reached up and untucked her bangs. Brushing them over to the left side of her face instead of the right, she let them hang a little lower on her face and secured them. If she couldn't even bear to look at her scar herself, then she definitely didn't want others staring at it. With her left eye covered, she tried once again to look up into the mirror and found it to be much easier. Finally able to meet her own eye thanks to having the other hidden, she let out a deep breath and turned away from the mirror. "Sorry," she said as she pulled open the door, knowing Yang would definitely have not gone too far from the door. Sure enough, the second she walked into the room, she spotted her girlfriend sitting on the edge of the bed. Watching the woman look up, she was unsurprised to see that the blonde immediately spotted the irregularity as her eyes flicked to the misplaced lock of hair. "Weiss dash." She held her hand up. She could hear it in her voice, the beginning of an attempt to convince her that she shouldn't have to hide. And though she appreciated it, and knew it was true, that wasn't how she felt in that moment. She met the brawler's eye. "It's what I need right now." "And you're sure you don't want to make an appointment with Dark?" "I'm fine." Weiss shook her head. "A little time is all I need, okay?" Both of them were silent for a few seconds, but the beautiful blonde soon gave a nod and stood up. As she did, Weiss recognized what she was wearing as the clothes that Reese had made. Just as she expected, they were perfect. The soft yellow blended beautifully against Yang's skin, while making her shining mane of hair stand out even more. They also went well with the black pants, which were simple but cut in a way that only served to accentuate how strong the woman's legs were. "Okay," Yang said with a weak smile, the same weak smile she'd been giving her for days. "So how do I look? Like someone you'd want to hire?" "More like someone who would be doing the hiring," Weiss corrected her, and walked over to place a hand on the woman's waist. "You look incredible." Good, good." She sounded relieved. Feeling a hand come up to rest on her left cheek, she flinched slightly, as Yang's thumb slipped underneath her bangs and grazed gently against the scar that lay hidden. Had it been anyone else, Weiss knew she would have pulled away, but even with the uncertainty the mark was causing her, Yang's touch still felt warm and comforting. "You sure you're ready to do this today? You shouldn't really be doing anything till you can actually eat something." "I need to stay busy." Weiss nodded. "Just sitting around is going to drive me crazy." "You sure?" "MHM." Weiss confirmed and reached up to pull Yang's hand away. "Are you sure you're ready for an interview? Aren't you supposed to be making plans with Ty?" Just as she had every time his name had been mentioned over the past few days, a flicker of doubt passed over her eyes. Though Weiss didn't know exactly what had happened during the last session since Yang had been far more concerned with keeping things happy and relaxed, she did know that it had not gone well. The only thing the woman had actually told her in fact was the small assignment Dark had given them, though Yang had definitely made no attempt to follow up on it. "We have 2 weeks. I'll make sure we do it, don't worry." "Promise?" "I promise." "All right," Weiss hummed, trusting her girlfriend's word. "But I should really get going. Blake said he finishes work soon, and I know he goes to bed afterwards." "MHM." Yang hummed and pressed a kiss against her forehead. "Just make sure you call me if you feel off, okay? I've got an early lecture I want to sit in on, but I'll come right back if you need me." Weiss had no doubt in that. "What's the lecture?" "Just some business stuff." Weiss raised an eyebrow in surprise, and saw Yang scratch the back of her head. "Some big restaurant guy is coming in to talk about the do's and don'ts of running a diner. I thought it'd be interesting." Weiss felt a smile pull at her lips. An interview and a business class on the same day, Yang was clearly starting to take her future seriously. While the woman's grades were good, and she definitely studied, mostly in the kitchen while cooking, Weiss had not exactly been blind to how much the brawler put off making those steps towards her future. And though it had never bothered her because that carefree attitude was something she loved about her girlfriend, she couldn't deny that the little bit of urgency Yang was displaying felt good to see. "It sounds fun." She smiled up at her. "You'll let me know how it goes." "MHM." Yang hummed, leaning down to press a short-lived kiss against her lips. "Now get going. You don't want to be late." "Right." She nodded, stepping away from the blonde and walking towards the door. "See you later." "Love you." "I love you too." With a fond look back at the woman, who had managed to make her feel safe despite the difficulty of the last few days, she gave her one last smile. It sucked to be leaving that safety, especially when there was a large part of her that wanted so badly to stay, but she knew that if she didn't start getting her life back to normal, then it would only be that much harder for her to move on and put the episode behind her. So, after taking a deep breath, she turned away from her source of comfort and pulled the door open to leave. Weiss was glad to have Hazel back. Although she had definitely enjoyed Emerald's company, and would have no problem if she wished to cover for her uncle again in the future, she doubted the girl could give her the same sense of safety that Hazel did. Just having the man sat in the front seat, his towering form causing his broad shoulders to just out from behind the seats, was reassuring to her. And given everything that had happened and the street they were driving down, it could not have come at a better time. Rough neighborhood, the man grumbled, looking out of the window at the derelict buildings and boarded-up shops. Reminds me of home. Weiss definitely saw the similarities to Mantle. Both were run down, their streets filled with empty stores, warehouses, and factories. Just like in Mantle, most of the buildings seemed to be apartment complexes, all with the same design and architecture that told her they were owned by the council. Overflowing garbage cans lined the road despite it having only been 3 days since collection day, and there was not a single place she could turn her eye without seeing graffiti. She knew it shouldn't, knew that it was merely a misconception enforced on her by her father, but she still felt a twinge of apprehension at being in such an area. Veil's forgotten, she mumbled. She watched from the corner of her eye as they passed the street's inhabitants, both human and faunus, though more of the former. They were not dirty or haggard as she knew the people in her father's circle liked to refer to them, but there was definitely a difference in their attire than what she would see in most other parts of Vale. Mismatched clothes with holes or tears, worn-out sneakers, a woman in a stained dressing gown. This is the kind of neighborhood my grandfather came from, she said. It's the kind of neighborhood a lot of people come from, Hazel added. She knew he was right. The street before her was only one of many. Too many. Though her grandfather had never been ashamed of where he'd come from, it was not something he talked about frequently. He was far too fixated on the future. As such, she had no idea what it must have been like for him growing up in such a place, nor what it was like for anyone else. And unfortunately, before she could ask Hazel any questions, he pulled into an open space in front of an indistinct set of apartments. We're here. He turned off the engine and looked back at her. Want me to come with you? There was almost a fatherly look in his brown eyes. Given that she had caught him glancing back at her multiple times in the rearview mirror, she suspected that Emerald had told him what had happened. Yes, please, she admitted. Though it pained her to admit it, she didn't exactly feel safe being in such an area, especially not after what had happened last time. Taking a step out of the car, she was greeted by the smell of smoke from 2 middle-aged women who stood nearby talking, giving them both a friendly smile as they looked at her, but earned nothing in return. Walking up to the door, she pressed one of the buttons for the apartment Blake had indicated and waited patiently. After only a few seconds, the call was answered and a very tired-sounding male voice came from the half-destroyed speaker. Hello? The man yawned. Hello, Mr. Fields, she said, leaning in a little to make sure he could hear her. It's Weiss Schnee. Blake told you I was coming. Oh yeah. Right. Come on up. The door buzzed and Hazel reached out to open it, Weiss stepping through to see nothing more than a short hallway with a well-worn staircase at the end. From the fact that there were 2 doors on either side, just on the first level, Weiss could tell that the apartments they led to were probably just as small. Just like they were outside, the walls were covered in graffiti and children's drawings. Are they like this in Mantle too? She asked, receiving only a nod in return. And the councils do nothing? Miss a payment and they do, he grunted. She let out a small sigh and made her way towards the stairs. The click of her heels on the hard tile echoed around her as she climbed to the 3rd floor and quickly found the door she was searching for. Tapping her knuckles against it, she held her bag in front of her and quickly made herself as presentable as possible. She doubted that Mr. Fields cared, but it was habit. The door opened to reveal a tall woman with pale blonde hair and kind yellow eyes which swept over them both. Her hair was a bit of a mess, and there was a tired look on her face. In her arms was a small girl, only a few years old but smiling and playing with her small pink nose. Hello, Weiss greeted her with a friendly smile. Mrs. Fields, I assume? MHM. She nodded and pulled her daughter's finger away from her nostril. Come in, come in. Wipe your feet. Stepping into the apartment as the woman stepped aside, Weiss turned and saw Hazel struggling to fit through the door. Though the sight was definitely amusing, a quick look around at the narrow hallway made her worry what the enormous man would do if he actually made it through. You can wait outside if you want, Hazel, she offered, stopping him in his tracks. You sure? I'll be fine, she smiled, earning a nod as he backed away. If she wasn't mistaken, she saw a hint of relief in the woman as her tail reached out to wrap around the handle and push the door closed. Letting the woman pass, she turned and followed her through the apartment. Just as she suspected, it was tiny. With only 2 rooms, a kitchen, and a tiny bathroom, there was barely enough room for a single person to live, let alone a family. Despite its size though, they clearly kept it very neat and tidy, and there was the same homey feeling to it that she felt whenever walking into Ty's house. Just in here, the woman said as they came to a stop in front of an open door. Grano, I'ma take Pata to the park. See ya when you wake up. All right, Mr. Fields replied, appearing in the doorway and pressing a kiss against his wife's cheek and poking his daughter's nose, causing her to giggle slightly. Have a good time. With a smile to them both, the woman squeezed past her and walked back towards the front door. Once she left, Weiss turned back to the man she was there to meet and saw that he too looked exhausted, though that was no surprise since Blake said he'd just finished work. You want a drink or something? I'm good, thank you. Weiss declined with a polite smile. I don't want to keep you awake too long. You're fine, he said with a shake of his head, moving aside and motioning for her to enter. I was surprised when Blake called me. After what happened, I figured you'd be giving us all a wide berth. I'm not one to blame the majority for the actions of an individual, Weiss clarified and walked into the living room. Just like the hallways, it was cozy with pictures of the family lining the walls and a television in the corner. Along the far wall was a plump couch that looked like it had seen better days. Good, the man said, a noticeable uptick in his voice. That girl has been an issue for a while. Luna tried to help her but though she tried her best to sound polite, she felt bad for cutting him off in his own home. I'd rather not talk about that, if you wouldn't mind. Right, the man nodded. Understandable. So what did you come here for? You? Weiss replied. Though first I feel I owe you an apology. The man gave her a confused tilt of his head and sat down on the couch. There was silence for a few seconds and his whiskers twitched anxiously, but she eventually took a deep breath and continued. When we last met, I misled you, she clarified. Me attending that meeting was done so under the assumption that your stories would aid me in bettering the STC in the future. They were painful memories that you forced yourself to relive, and I should have been honest with you all from the start. The truth is that I actually quit my job that morning, so it is no longer within my power to fix the problems you and your friends from the meeting faced at the company's hand. I'm sorry. Oh, he leaned back into the chair. There was definitely an air of disappointment around him, but he shook his head. That's nothing to apologize for. We knew it was a long shot anyway. Regardless, Weiss countered, choosing to ignore that last comment. I should have been honest. Thanks, I guess. Fields nodded and stifled a yawn. So why did you go? Well, Weiss walked over and sat down on a small stool that was positioned next to a tiny dining table. Making sure to look the man in the eye, she saw his flick over to her scar and found herself glad she had hidden it. I attended the meeting because, despite no longer being able to change anything at the STC, I am serious about trying to understand your issues and do what I can to create a healthier workplace for everyone. And because of that, I reached out to a friend of mine that still works at my father's company and asked her to inquire with the maintenance staff about what you told me. I doubt you got anything there, the man said. Never really talked to them about it either. I didn't, she admitted. But a few of them there did remember you. They told my friend you were a hard and diligent worker who was very good at your job and was always willing to help cover others' work if there was more that needed to be done. It's that which made me want to speak to you. He looked confused again. I just did my job. No, you excelled at your job, Weiss corrected him. A man called Justin Greenwood even said that he was surprised you were never hired full-time and promoted. He was always too kind. Fields nodded. He's the one who swapped places with me when things got worse. Offering him a smile and reminding herself to put in a good word for Justin with Edward, she leaned forward and surveyed the man before her. She wasn't sure how he would take the next thing she had to say. Honestly, from what your ex-coworkers had to say about you, I'm entitled to agree with him. His eyes widened a little, and he looked up at her. Which is why I would like to offer you the position of maintenance director in the company I am starting. His eyes shot open that time. Just as she suspected, the man was taken aback by the sudden proposal. She didn't blame him. She had just offered him a job to head up an entire department after all. WH what? He blanched. She couldn't help but smile a little at his shock. I understand that you don't see yourself as a people person, she chuckled, and that this job would come with a lot of responsibility, but you are clearly a man who is very good at your job and cares about it being done well. That is the kind of person I am looking for. Crossing her legs, she waited patiently for an answer. She knew what she had just asked of the man. He already had a job, was already providing for his family, and she was asking him to abandon that for an uncertainty in a business that didn't even exist yet. Anybody would be uncertain about such an offer. What's the company? The man finally asked with a hint of caution in his voice. At the moment? Nothing, Weiss admitted. But once we get it up and running, my business partner is the owner of a patent that could revolutionize travel in Remnant. And how long will it take to set it up? I'm meeting with my partner this week, but I doubt we will be ready to move forward for at least a few months. So I have time to think? Of course. Weiss nodded. Take your time, but once we finalize everything, we will be moving quickly to get things set up, so there will likely be a lot of work to do. So I would like your answer before that happens. He let out an uncertain breath. I'm not sure. I'll have to run it by my wife first. Of course. Weiss repeated and stood up. Digging into her bag, she found her business card. Here is my contact information. The email is a lot more reliable. If you come to a decision or have any questions, then please reach out. Thanks, he said, clearly still a little stunned as he placed the card on the side table. Is that all? MHM. Right. He stood up. For a split second, he held out his hand, but quickly retracted it. I'll show you out then. Giving the man a small nod, she followed him out into the hallway and towards the front door. It wasn't a long walk by any means, but it was more than enough to tell the man was already thinking about her offer. And as his hand landed on the door, he looked back at her curiously. Can I just ask? He seemed to rethink his questions, but she gave a small tilt of his head to urge him to continue. Well, why me? You probably know hundreds more better people for the job. He wasn't technically wrong. She certainly did know others who were capable at such a job, and many more who were far more experienced. However, none of them were better for the job. I want to change the world, she replied simply with a small shrug. Just like my grandfather did. And he understood that it is much easier to do so when the people at your side care about changing it too. It was an answer she had rehearsed for her meeting with Fletch, but its words were still true. Her grandfather had understood that while ideas and money went a long way, those things alone would never be enough. To change the world, the people with those ideas and money also had to care. They had to be passionate. And her father was living proof that he was right. He had all the money in the world, and thousands of employees with ideas, yet the STC had done nothing but create scrolls and meaningless household luxuries for the past few decades. Thankfully, though, the answer was enough to satisfy the man, and he gave a small nod as he pulled the door open. I'll think about it. That's all I ask. She smiled and stepped outside of the apartment, Hazel pushing himself off of the wall as she did. Have a good sleep, Mr. Fields. You too. He realized his mistake and shook his head. Have a nice day, I mean. Chuckling slightly, she bowed her head respectfully to the man and began the walk back to her car. She was genuinely unsure if the man was going to accept her offer, but she hoped he did. As she slipped into the back seat, however, there was one thing she was certain of, and that was that for the first time in 2 days, she was actually feeling a little hungry.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.